Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Thundering Hooves, Yellowstone's bison herds, and it will be presented by wildlife biologist Erin Bott. Erin, thank you so much for being here today. Let's just go ahead and jump right in.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Today is a pretty interesting topic. I don't know if any of you have ever traveled to Yellowstone, but if you have, no doubt you encountered bison on your trip out there. Bison are one of the most iconic and charismatic animals on the landscape in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And they're also one of the most controversial. The topic of conserving these wild bison is very heated and complex. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about bison and kind of their evolutionary background, their biology, their ecology and behavior. And then we'll move in specifically to the history of bison in Yellowstone, past and present. So we'll dive into it. As I was introduced, I'm a wildlife biologist. I have lived my whole life in the American Mountain West, where my family's been for the last 6 generations, just outside of Yellowstone. I've had the opportunity to work with many different native species of wildlife here in the northern Rocky Mountain Range, down along the Colorado Plateau. I specialize in large carnivores. Specifically, I'm a wolf biologist. I did two graduate degrees on wolves, and specifically wolves in and around Yellowstone National Park. And I've had the opportunity to work with bison, wild bison herds. So we're going to be talking again a lot about bison today, and hopefully we'll bring this home to you. If you're interested in going to Yellowstone, this will maybe make you appreciate these incredible animals a little bit more. And if you've already been there, then maybe it will encourage you to want to go back and look at bison through a whole new lens. I've grown up around Yellowstone my whole life. I've been to Yellowstone thousands of times, literally, and worked there for many, many years. And I have never been in Yellowstone and not seen a buffalo or a bison. It is a guaranteed sighting just about every time you go into Yellowstone to encounter one of these really incredible animals. So again, if you've been to Yellowstone, it's very likely that you saw one of these incredible animals out on the landscape. Bison, scientifically known as bison, the plains bison, are the species that live in Yellowstone National Park. These are the largest land animals in North America. A really impressive kind of beast straight from the Pleistocene. Males weigh up to 2,000 pounds, and the females tip the scales at a dainty 1,000 plus pounds. So there's quite a bit of what we call sexual dimorphism between the males and females, males being substantially larger. We refer to the males as bulls, and we refer to the females as cows, and their offspring are what we call calves. Bison, despite being huge, are very agile and very quick. They can run over 35 miles an hour. They can jump over 6-foot tall fences, and they are like tanks. They break through and blast through just about anything that they can't jump or over or run around. Bison are really iconic here in North America in particular, but we'll get into their evolutionary history in just a minute and talk about kind of where they're from and how they have a shared history all over the northern hemisphere. But we have in Yellowstone what we recognize as the plains bison, the subspecies that lived across the Great Plains and throughout even the Rocky Mountains and west of the Rocky Mountains in some locations. And we contrast that with a very rare subspecies known as the wood buffalo, or Bison athabasci, which looks slightly different, but it kind of takes a trained eye to recognize the wood bison or the wood buffalo versus the plains buffalo. And you'll notice that while I'm talking and giving this presentation, I'm switching back and forth between giving the more formal bison versus referring to this animal as a buffalo. And in North America, it's very common to use buffalo and bison interchangeably. In fact, I grew up calling them buffalo, so I'll probably keep slipping and say buffalo in the remainder of this presentation. But it is important to realize that this animal is not technically a buffalo, not like the water buffalo or the buffalo that we have in India and in Africa. The bison is more closely related to the Bos genus, more closely related to cattle, etc. But again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Because they're such a large animal, bison have a long gestation period. Typically, they go into the breeding season, which we call the rut, in August. They're the first of the ungulates, the hoofed animals, to go into heat through their reproductive rituals in the late summer, where large male bison will spar and compete for breeding rights over harems of cows. And the winner basically gets the opportunity to breed with as many females as he can in that harem. Males and females typically are separated throughout most of the year. We have large maternal herds, matriarchal herds that kind of dictate the vast majority of bison movements across the landscape. These large maternal herds are the ones that you're most likely to come across, and they're the ones that are leading their offspring and one another into areas where there's rich forage. The males form smaller bachelor groups. They're more independent. They kind of are competing with one another during the breeding season, but then they form maybe smaller groups of 10 to 20 throughout the rest of the year, and then only come together with the females generally around the breeding season. And this is again a part of what we call intersexual competition. So males and females have different objectives when it comes to foraging. The females are trying to stay together in order to keep their numbers safe and their offspring safe, those precious calves that are dropped in the spring, generally in April and May. So as a group, they're able to protect their young more effectively, but by sticking together as a group, they also are giving up the opportunity to forage more independently, and in some cases even grow larger and gain as much mass as, say, independent bulls. So the bulls that are more interested in successfully reproducing, they're going to be off on their own, and they're going to be foraging as much as possible to get as much mass as possible, so that come breeding season, they'll be able to compete more successfully with other males and again have rights to breed. So at any given time in Yellowstone, about 50% of the calves that are born can be traced to about 10% of the males through direct lineage. So it really is a monopoly during the breeding season. Just a few males sire a vast majority of the calves. And the calves, as I already mentioned, are born in the spring, typically in April and May, some of the first babies to hit the ground. And they're endearingly referred to as little red dogs when they're first born. They're born kind of red. And yeah, again, very cute and almost cuddly. You can go out and see them at the beginning of the Yellowstone spring and summer season. And they retain this rich red color until they're about 2.5, 3 months old, at which time they start to turn brown. Both males and female bison have true horns, these keratin sheaths that go over a bony core. as again kind of tools and also weapons to protect one another. But bison, again, being so formidable and so large, are pretty challenging to hunt on the landscape. So there's not a lot of predators that take advantage of them. They kind of are the top dogs. And yeah, what a magnificent creature. I think it's important for us to understand the evolutionary history of bison, the phylogenetics of bison, and how they came to be, especially in North America as an iconic species that roamed in the millions. It's important to realize that bison, again, have close relations with cattle. So about 3.5 to 4 million years ago, these two families broke apart. The Bos, the family of cattle, and the bison family, the bison genus. And because they are still closely related, bison and cattle can actually introgressively breed and produce fertile offspring and hybridization. So today we still hear about bison hybrids or cattle bison hybrids, beefalo, and these are commonly found across the West on private operations where people are raising beefalo or bison for meat production. But bison are a Holarctic species. They can be found basically everywhere in the northern hemisphere, like many of our animals that we have here across North America, including wolves and grizzly bears and moose. Bison probably originated in Central Asia and ranged throughout Siberia and could be found even through Europe. Today we have a very small population of a different species of bison found in the Caucasus of Europe today. But throughout North America, we had a handful of varying bison species during the Pleistocene or the Ice Age. The largest of these was the longhorned bison and the bison antiquus and bison latifrons. These bison that weighed approximately 1,500 pounds heavier than the bison we have today. So they tipped the scale between 3,500 pounds and 4,000 pounds. Really large animals with huge horns. And they dominated the landscape from Alaska down through British Columbia and Alberta throughout the large belly of what we recognize today as the contiguous United States, and even through central and southern Mexico. So during the Pleistocene, when we had a lot more biodiversity regarding megafauna, we had short-faced cave bears, we had lions, we had the American cheetah, we had dire wolves, we had mastodons and woolly mammoths. We also had a wide variety of bison species. And as humans interacted with bison over thousands of years, humans arriving probably around 20,000 years ago in North America across the Bering Land Bridge, we began to experience a great die-off of a lot of our large animals. And there's a lot of speculation about what caused these die-offs, how we lost our woolly mammoths and our mastodons, and subsequently these varying bison species. But it probably was a compounding factor of humans on the landscape over-exploiting resources and climate change, and probably introduced diseases as well. So all of our bison populations that we had, these larger bison that are now extinct, all vanished about 5 to 10,000 years ago. And as these other larger animals disappeared on the landscape, it created an open niche for the bison that we're most familiar with, the plains bison, which dominated, again, mostly the Great Plains, but really ranged across a large portion of North America. And the bison herds in the early 1600s, 1700s, and even the early 1800s, when Lewis and Clark were crossing the continent, ranged across the plains, and probably about 30 million is our best guesstimate for how many bison were roaming on the landscape at that time, which is tremendous. For a long time, we thought there might be as many as 60 million, but based off of calculating how much vegetation there is on the landscape, it's probably, it would have been probably closer to 30 million bison ranging across North America, which is still an incomprehensible amount of bison, filling in the niche left behind by the great die-off of these other larger animals, such as the mastodon and the mammoths, etc. So that's a little bit about the history of bison and where they came from and where they went. But now we're specifically going to be talking today about bison in Yellowstone. And just to bring things into perspective, Yellowstone is situated in northwestern Wyoming predominantly. And it is kind of at the tail end of what we refer to as the Northern Rocky Mountain Range. The Northern Rocky Mountain Range really has its distal point in the Wind River Range in northwestern Wyoming, and it extends up through Montana and Idaho and all the way up through Canada into the Yukon. So this large cordillera of mountains that give this area high elevation, and it therefore dictates the kind of vegetation and the kind of fauna that we see on the landscape. But again, Yellowstone is kind of right at the edge of the Great Plains. You can see in this map here. And Yellowstone is the world's first national park. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but it's important to realize that often when referring to Yellowstone, we're talking about the ecosystem. So the Greater Yellowstone area or the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, because animals and plants don't really give a hoot about human boundaries that we create, political arbitrary lines that are invisible to them on the landscape. Yellowstone itself is mostly a park covered by lodgepole pine trees. So it's kind of this very high elevated desert of a not very nutritious coniferous forest. Yellowstone on average is about 6,000 to 7,000 feet above sea level. It's a large volcanic plateau. Yellowstone itself is a volcano. There's a thermal plume underneath Yellowstone, which superheats water, groundwater, which then erupts from chambers just under the surface of the Earth's crust into large steaming geysers, which make the area so famous. People for thousands of years have inhabited the Yellowstone area. As far back as 11,000 years ago, archaeologists have been able to determine that indigenous peoples, specifically the Clovis peoples, inhabited this area. And we have found Clovis points, these spear points and arrow points created from obsidian that we have actually been able to document covered in animal blood, which we have done DNA testing on and found that these spear points and these arrowhead points were used to hunt bison in this area, as well as elk and bighorn sheep. So that's some pretty cool research that we've discovered in Yellowstone. For a long time, the Euro-American myth was that Yellowstone was uninhabited prior to Euro-American discovery of the area because the indigenous peoples were superstitious about Yellowstone and its geysers. But we know, in fact, that that is incorrect. That's a falsehood. For thousands of years, people came and lived around the Yellowstone Lake and around the geyser basins. And the relationship that the indigenous peoples had with bison, specifically the plains bison, was integral to their way of life. As the horse was introduced to North America in the 1500s and 1600s by the Spanish explorers, indigenous peoples got a hold of horses and then they used them for their own gain by dominating the bison herds on the Great Plains. The horse is arguably one of the first tools used to kind of end the domain of the bison across the Great Plains. With the access to the horse, indigenous peoples were able to travel much quicker across the Great Plains and hunt more bison more frequently, which profited the people because they had more resources and therefore their populations were able to grow much quicker. And bison just became almost a legendary, even a mythic part of their way of living. Many parts of the buffalo were used for different purposes and for sustaining their semi-nomadic way of life. So again, a really important role bison played for many indigenous people across the Great Plains, but Yellowstone itself was kind of right on the edge of the Great Plains. And while we had lots of bison in the Yellowstone area, it wasn't anything like the Great Plains. We had perhaps several hundred, maybe even a couple thousand bison in the area, but we did not have millions of bison roaming across Yellowstone. As Euro-Americans began to explore westward, we had the era of the mountain men, really beginning with John Coulter at the end of the Lewis and Clark expedition, going up through Jim Bridger. These trappers lived in and around the Yellowstone area and documented many accounts of the wildlife that they came across in this particular region. And bison were recorded as one of the species that were found in this part of the world. So now as we come to Yellowstone, we think about, again, this national park, this great 2.2 million acre region where you can go and see wolves and grizzly bears, and you have endemic species such as the Yellowstone cutthroat trout, and you have one of the largest migrating elk herds in the world. But again, most people come to this area expecting to see bison as well as some of these other charismatic creatures. And just to the south of Yellowstone Park, we have Grand Teton National Park, which was created in 1950, many decades after Yellowstone National Park was created. But wildlife, as I've already mentioned, don't recognize the arbitrary political boundaries that people set up. And so you see a lot of these animals outside of the parks as well as inside the parks. But as people began to explore these areas, they were really touched and impressed by the geology of the landscape. And that was ultimately why Yellowstone was created as a national park back in 1872. Nevertheless, wildlife were also crucial in influencing the protectionist ideals that the people had during that era in the late 1800s of conserving this part of the land. And you can see here on this map kind of the historic range and haunts of pre-settlement bison distribution on the landscape. And they would have utilized a large portion of the Yellowstone country, but understanding that a lot of this area is covered in coniferous forest, it's really the valleys, especially just to the north of Yellowstone National Park, that were essential for bison as they would migrate seasonally. As more people became aware of Yellowstone National Park, finally it was decided by the federal government and Congress that perhaps this area of the world needed to be protected as a public park. And because there were just territories at this time, no states in northwestern Wyoming, it was proposed that Yellowstone be protected as a national park, primarily to preserve its geological oddities. And so in 1872, the Grant administration protected this part of the world. Now, at the same time, bison everywhere else in America were quickly diminishing. And this was because of manifest destiny and Euro-American expansion westward, where people encountered bison literally by the millions. And this is a period that we refer to as the Great Wanton Destruction of North America's wildlife. So this really tragic period where people began to capitalize as quickly as they could on wildlife in North America. This happened in Canada as well as in the United States, but in the United States, we have what's known as the Public Trust Doctrine, which was passed in 1843, which is really cool at its heart, but it did cause a major heartburn in the latter half of the 19th century. compared to Europe, where wildlife is owned by landowners, unless you were a monarch or you owned a lot of estate, a lot of land where wildlife could roam free. Most individuals did not have access to wildlife. And when the United States was created, it was pretty early on determined that things like wildlife and water could not be privately owned. And wildlife was a resource that belonged to the public at large. Again, the public trust doctrine. But there was a problem with this because as people began to realize that all it took was a gun and some bullets and they could have a living, people began market hunting and they began over exploiting the wildlife that we have in North America to the point that many species went extinct or regionally extinct. And bison were one of those species that just about died out. The tragedy of bison loss, as well as elk loss and pronghorn loss, preceded that of our large carnivore eradication programs. And a lot of people were moving westward, shooting these animals to make way for livestock. Also, they were eradicating these populations in order to make a quick buck off of their hides. We had the hide hunters. We also had a fetish for consuming bison tongues at this time. So people would hunt and kill bison just for parts of their body that they wanted to consume. And again, this is what we refer to as the Great Slaughter of the 1800s. Bison roamed just about everywhere, but particularly with the advent of the Transcontinental Railroad and mass migration of livestock, people very quickly, in just a few decades, were able to almost completely annihilate bison from about 30 million down to just about 1,000 or 2,000 are the estimates in both Canada and the United States. So what a horrific chapter in wildlife history here in North America. And this map here shows just where some of the remnant herds were left. Now, Yellowstone plays a really crucial role in this story because it was created again as a national park in 1872. And very quickly after the park was created, Congress asked the military to monitor and protect the national park. The National Park Service was not actually created until 1916. So you had nearly 50 years where the national park existed without a National Park Service. But the War Department came in and the military protected and conserved the resources of Yellowstone. And I have given a presentation for NatHab already on the history of Yellowstone. And I go into more depth as to how this went about. But in 1894, the Lacey Act was passed, where the military had the authority to punish poachers who were capitalizing off of the wildlife in Yellowstone. And it was known at this time that there was a small remnant herd of bison in Pelican Valley, just to the north of Yellowstone Lake. And after the military had finally cracked down really hard on the last of the poachers that were targeting bison in this area, and this is a photo in the bottom right-hand corner of bison heads that were confiscated from poachers by the military in Yellowstone. It was estimated that we had about 23 buffalo left, and that was it. 23 buffalo left, really, in the vast majority of the contiguous United States. There were some small buffalo herds north up in Canada, but essentially from 30 million down to 23 is what we had whittled the buffalo population, the wild buffalo population, down to. And again, what a tragedy. But it was here in Pelican Valley, this very secluded part of the park, that bison tentatively held on to existence in this part of the world. It was in 1902 that the military and other invested individuals in and around Yellowstone wanted to help bring bison back from the point of almost annihilation. And the park was able to purchase 18 pregnant female buffalo from Montana and 3 bull bison from Texas that were privately owned, not wild, but privately owned. And they brought them up to Mammoth, which is on the northern portion of Yellowstone and Montana's border. And after a while, they relocated that herd over to Lamar Valley, where the Yellowstone Buffalo Ranch was built. If you've been to Yellowstone, you'll probably recognize the Yellowstone Buffalo Ranch. They don't ranch buffalo there anymore, but it's a great spot for going to see wolves, especially in the wintertime. So for the first several decades, Yellowstone carefully raised bison like livestock, basically. The 23 indigenous bison were still on the landscape in Pelican Valley, and they were slowly growing in number. But the military and eventually the National Park Service in 1916 took the initiative to try and help propagate bison on the landscape by corralling and basically ranching bison. They would put them out into the fields during the day, they would corral them at night, and over the decades, the population grew substantially, up to over 1,000. And eventually, bison from this population were corralled and removed and put down to interbreed with the indigenous buffalo herd in Pelican Valley. And after a point, bison were no longer managed exclusively by the bison management operation in Yellowstone National Park, and they were finally allowed to go off and range on their own throughout the majority of the park as the park's policies towards natural regulation began to change. And this graph kind of shows the history of Yellowstone and how bison slowly were able to recover again from the point of near extinction to ultimately growing to our present population today, which is in the thousands. Just as of last year, last August, we counted just under 6,000 bison in Yellowstone National Park. But for the first several decades, Yellowstone was operating in a very different manner than you would recognize Yellowstone National Park's policy today. The park was perceived to be a place where people could go and enjoy themselves. It was a pleasuring ground, and natural regulation or the natural processes of the park were considered a secondary priority to the park's purpose. And so for the first few decades, again, people were literally ranching buffalo in Yellowstone National Park. They were not allowed to wander around and be wild and free. And in many cases, they would cull bison when they thought that the numbers were getting too high. And this all stopped in 1968 when the Park Service as a whole adopted its policy of natural regulation, basically arguing that from now on, we're going to let nature be the primary objective of the National Park Service. We're going to protect the natural environment and let things be how nature intended. And when this happened, the bison population really exponentially started to grow, and it began to take off until again it reached in the thousands. And before this period where we allowed natural regulation, bison from Yellowstone were frequently removed from the park, and other populations across the American West were built off of Yellowstone bison, including some in central and southern Utah and in Arizona, Colorado, and in the Dakotas and Nebraska as well. Now, it's important to realize that bison were privately owned elsewhere in the US, and today you might travel out to some areas throughout the Midwest or even the West, and you might encounter bison herds. But what makes Yellowstone unique is that it is the only area in the lower 48 states where an indigenous bison herd has persistently been on the landscape. They were never completely eradicated. And not only that, but their genetics have been pure, they've been maintained, and there is no crossbreeding with cattle. So Yellowstone really has this incredible reputation of being the last area in the lower 48 states where bison were not eradicated and then reintroduced. They have been persistent on the landscape since prehistory. And today, again, when you travel through Yellowstone National Park, you can have the opportunity to encounter thousands of these animals on the landscape. Mostly, they tend to be in the valleys. So in Hayden Valley and Lamar Valley and along the Madison River towards West Yellowstone, you can see thousands of bison at any given time of the year. And we've been able to track how these animals migrate on the landscape. We probably have more bison now than we would have had the park existed 250 years ago. Nevertheless, we've been able to document again where these animals are moving, and because it's a high elevated plateau, bison have the tendency to want to leave the park in the winter as well to get to lower elevations where the grazing is easier. How bison on the landscape have affected the environment has also been very interesting. We have a tremendous amount of bison, but there are very few animals that actively prey upon bison just because they are so big and dangerous. In the 1990s, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park, and our grizzly bear population has increased fourfold since the 1990s as well, after being listed as a threatened species in the 1970s. And these two large apex predators very irregularly and infrequently prey upon bison. The reason for not wanting to kill buffalo, I think, is pretty obvious. They are difficult to kill, they're large, they're dangerous, they protect one another and their young, and there are other prey species on the menu which are easier to kill, such as elk. So wolves almost primarily target elk. 90 to 95% of their diet is elk. But bison live out their lives on the landscape, and perhaps the number one predator that does impact bison herds can be winter. So winter severity, dying of old age, of disease, or of malnutrition leads to a lot of dead biomass on the landscape, and predator populations can benefit just by scavenging off of bison without actually having to take the risk of bringing down these large animals. And during the period where bison populations were growing in number, our elk populations were actually decreasing in number. So in the early 1990s, the famous Yellowstone elk herd in the northern range peaked out at about 21,000 elk in one herd, which is a tremendous number of elk on the landscape, arguably an unhealthy amount of elk on the landscape. And I have given a webinar for Natural Habitat Adventures specifically on the Yellowstone elk herd that you can go and watch for more information on this. But the elk population began to decrease in the mid 90s and then into the early 2000s because of human hunting regime changes, as well as the introduction of an apex predator like the wolf and the recovery of mountain lions and grizzly bears on the landscape. And since then, the elk population has stabilized at a more natural and a healthier carrying capacity of about 7,000 elk on the landscape. But if you contrast this with the graph where I showed the increase of bison on the landscape, some scientists are interested in looking at apparent competition between bison and elk. And it's supposed that the number of bison, which are now equal to that of the elk in the northern range, are perhaps suppressing the elk's population from regaining its higher numbers or its historic numbers as the two animals compete for the same resources on the landscape, namely grasses and sedges. Also, you can't take us out of the equation because humans have now a very complex story to tell with our interactions with bison on the landscape. Bison jams are kind of an endearing term that we frequently use to describe bison utilizing the roadways in Yellowstone National Park, especially in the wintertime, where these animals are trying to find the path of least resistance and are trying to travel along road corridors, which can slow traffic down considerably. But people are more likely to encounter bison than any other animal in Yellowstone National Park, and because they appear docile, many people are injured by buffalo every year. Um, these signs are stuck all over, they're plastered all over Yellowstone National Park, and I'm sure that you've heard news stories or seen videos or pictures of people who get gored by buffalo every year. And again, many people just assume that these animals are tame and that they're slow and perhaps dim-witted, but the reality is quite the opposite. And bison are hands down the most dangerous animals that we have in Yellowstone. It's not the grizzly bears, it's not the moose, it's not the wolves, it's the bison. And many people are injured by these animals because they take them for granted and they act inappropriately around these animals. Now, the next chapter that I'll quickly cover about the complexity of coexistence with bison on the landscape has to do with their limitations in distribution on their historic range throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem due to a bacterium known as Brucella abortus or brucellosis. This is a very dangerous disease which is quite common in our Yellowstone buffalo herds. Brucellosis is a Eurasian disease. It was not native to North America, and it was introduced to North American wildlife via our Eurasian livestock. So as people brought livestock with them across the continent and out west, cattle specifically spread brucellosis into our bison herds and into our elk herds. And while bison were being ranched in the northern part of Yellowstone in the early 1900s, it's most likely this is the time when our bison contracted brucellosis, where it was transmitted again from domestic cattle into wild bison. And brucellosis causes miscarriages. It causes mothers, both cows and, domestic cows and bison cows, as well as elk, to abort their fetuses. And this is a highly contagious disease that can be spread from one animal to another, mostly through the afterbirth material or the fluids that come from birthing. And this disease generally has a lot of economic implications because it is also considered a zoonotic disease. Excuse me. A zoonotic disease just means that not only does it infect animals, but it can also cross over and infect people. And when people become infected with brucellosis, we often refer to it as undulant fever. Undulant fever is not often fatal to people, but it can offer up it can manifest in flu-like symptoms and can last for months to even years unless antibiotics are administered. And it's for this very reason that dairy products have to be pasteurized in order to be sold in most stores. The USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has been working for decades and spent millions of dollars to try and eradicate brucellosis from our livestock herds, and successfully eradicated brucellosis from all of our livestock herds in the early 2000s. But it wasn't long after it was successfully eradicated and being vaccinated for in our livestock herds that it began to show its ugly head again in states like Montana, where wildlife elk specifically were transmitting brucellosis back into cattle herds. And Yellowstone's buffalo population has a high seroprevalence of this disease. Seroprevalence meaning that the antibodies for this disease are found in the blood serums of these animals. So as much as 60% of bison in Yellowstone show seroprevalence of having been exposed to brucellosis at one time or another. And because of this, there is a large concern about bison migrating outside of the park and interacting and commingling with cattle herds. There's a lot of cattle grazing just outside of Yellowstone and reinfecting cattle that have been vaccinated for this disease. Now, there is no vaccination or treatment for wildlife that are infected with brucellosis. Once it's in the herd, it persists within the herd. And again, it's really hard to eradicate. And if livestock become infected, often they have to be culled, they have to be slaughtered in order for the herd to be declared clean again. And for economic viability, it's easy to understand why ranchers and why departments of agriculture are concerned about brucellosis transmission from wildlife into cattle herds. It can really shut down an entire family or an entire company's operation when this happens. So because of the high concern over bison reinfecting cattle herds with brucellosis, the federal government in 2000 created the Interagency Bison Management Program, where bison are managed according to the dictates of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or APHIS, and they meet with the Intertribal Buffalo Council, the Montana Department of Livestock, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the National Park Service, and the Forest Service, the Nez Perce tribe, and several other groups to determine how bison can best be managed on the landscape. And unfortunately, this is a very complicated issue because as the bison population continues to grow in Yellowstone, its growth outpaces the carrying capacity of the environment. And every year, bison tend to migrate north out of Yellowstone into Montana, where they are seeking more foraging opportunities in the heart of the winter on lower elevations. And a lot of these lower elevations, again, are either occupied by cattle or are occupied by people, where housing and industrial development is quickly outpacing really what is needed for the health and the maintenance of the environment at large surrounding Yellowstone National Park. So because of a federal mandate, bison in the hundreds and sometimes in the thousands, as they leave the park, they have to be corralled and rounded up. And in a very unsavory, in an unsavory topic, bison are culled out of Yellowstone every year, which means they're shipped off to slaughter, and the meat is then donated to many indigenous tribes. Animals infected with brucellosis can be consumed if the meat is fully cooked, so there's no danger of that, of the disease being transmitted through the consumption of these, excuse me, of these diseased animals. But we're working really hard to try and create a better solution for bison management in Yellowstone. This is not the National Park Service's policy, but the Park Service is being directed to participate in the removal of bison that leave Yellowstone National Park. And to try and again mitigate some of these conflicts, there is a large indigenous hunt which takes place on the northern boundary of Yellowstone, where various tribes get to participate in coming out and hunting buffalo as they leave the park. But only about a few hundred of those animals are actually harvested. There's also an interest to quarantine these animals and then to ship them off to other areas where bison restoration is of interest to different groups, specifically a lot of Native American groups. For example, the Fort Peck Indian Reservation in Montana they've been working very hard with Yellowstone National Park to quarantine animals and then to bring animals that test negative for brucellosis out onto the landscape for reintroduction. But the overall interest in reintroducing and quarantining bison is far below the needs to remove buffalo as they come off of the National Park Service lands. So about half of the bison that actually come off of the Park Service's lands are basically, yeah, quarantined and then shipped off to other areas for reintroduction. But the other half that remain are shipped off to slaughter. And this is something that is highly contentious and is people are not happy about this all around. But as we're working to move forward with bison management on the landscape, we're trying very hard to expand the tolerance zones for Yellowstone bison outside of northern Yellowstone and also outside of western Yellowstone in Montana, where bison primarily migrate out of the park. And in the last couple of years, we've been successful in expanding these management areas where bison can leave the park. But otherwise, we still have a long way to go. Again, the bison herds in Yellowstone are growing in number. We had just south of 6,000 bison counted last August, which is a tremendous amount of bison. It was estimated earlier during the interagency bison management team meeting in the 2000s that only about 3,000 bison would be living in Yellowstone National Park, and that was kind of the estimated carrying capacity. But we're now nearly double that. And as we move forward, we're trying to think more progressively about how we can find better and more socially acceptable ways of coexisting with these animals on the landscape rather than just culling them. Bison, I think, again, are a tremendous species. They were classified during the Obama administration, or they were empowered during the Obama administration as the national mammal of the United States. And I think that you can't pick a better symbol of this incredible country. And bison truly are something right out of the Pleistocene. They seem mythic in their power and in their majesty. And I look forward to resolving a lot of these conflicts that we have with these animals so that we can see them elsewhere on the landscape. And with that, I will conclude. So thank you very much.
Aaron, thank you so much. You always bring such insight to these presentations. We've got lots of questions, so I will just remind people quickly that they can add their questions by submitting them via the control panel. Let's dive in though. One person is curious about the shaggy coats. Does anybody who raises buffalo actually use the wool for anything?
Yes, they do actually. You can find various bison wool products online. A lot of bison ranchers do harvest the wool from these animals and then make cool things that you can purchase.
I don't know if I'd want that job. Is it pretty difficult? Have you ever seen it happen?
Yeah, I have. I haven't seen it happen, but my brother works in bison ranching, and yeah, he's participated in it, and it can be challenging.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay. Is there any relation that you're aware of between the North American bison and the Cape buffalo in Africa?
Very, very, very distantly. We're about probably 5 million to 7 million years ago, those two families broke apart.
Okay. What effect, if any, has the Canadian wildfire smoke had on these and other animals in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem?
Can you ask that one more time? What has the Canadian bison?
No, the wildfires in Canada. Has the smoke affected the wildlife in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem that you're aware of in any way?
No, not that I'm aware of. We have in Yellowstone and in the American West, we have huge fires that very often make this area smoky, and we don't like it, but I am unaware of any negative effects.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about bison's eyesight? Is it poor, good? Anything interesting related
Yeah.
to that question?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, we don't know exactly how good it is, but it's probably similar to our eyesight. So they've got good noses and good ears and good eyes, and they can see you, but they do have their eyes set on the sides of their head rather than in front of them because they aren't a predatory species, and so you got to be careful again when approaching buffalo, which is never a good idea. We recommend in Yellowstone that you maintain a distance of at least 25 yards from these animals at all times.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on white buffalo? Some of which are on the Blackfeet Reservation in Minnesota, or it says and Minnesota, I think. Um, any comments or thoughts about white buffalo, white bison?
Yeah, so I know about the white buffalo up on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana there. They're just it's a it's a genetic twist, right? It's a recessive gene basically that appears in the gene pool every now and then. So they're not albino. It's just kind of a bizarre trait that pops up every now and then.
Hmm. Um, does a bison have to be tranquilized in order to shear its wool?
I don't think it has to in all cases because if you're raising bison, you have what's called a buffalo chute, or it's like a cattle chute. Um, so the animals come through the corral and then it kind of the gates of this chute hug the animal and hold them in place. And I don't know for sure because I'm not speaking from personal experience, but I imagine that you might be able to remove some of the fur in one of those chutes. So,
Got it. Got it. Interesting. Well, that's the last question we have time for today. I just want to close by sharing a comment from one of our viewers. Thank you, Erin, for a very moving presentation. I can tell you really love these animals. I want to visit Yellowstone. It has been on my bucket list. So thank you again for such a great presentation and for inspiring us to learn more and maybe come up and visit you. I'll turn it back to
yeah,
you for closing comments.
thank you. And thanks for the compliment, you guys. I do hope that everyone gets the chance to come up and see Yellowstone and at the very least to someday see some bison because they truly are a magnificent animal. And yeah, thank you again for tuning in.
I also want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us again next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.